I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why we need to do risk assessments, and it'll be quite apparent from the next video.
I've dropped an inch. Yeah.
That's the end of the video. As you can see from the video clip, it's actually some funny clips I found on YouTube, but all of those things that went wrong, thankfully I chose clips where no one got really injured or hurt, but all of those, people could have got really badly injured and hurt. So the main reason we do risk assessing is to stop people from hurting themselves, hurting other people, and generally protecting the environment around them, and to not cause any undue harm to anyone, anything, any animal, any organism, unnecessarily, basically. So the whole process is to work out all the reasons why something bad might happen and to basically stop it happening by going, maybe if we did it a different way or we put in certain mitigations, the accident that could potentially happen will definitely not happen. Cool. So I'm going to read off. So risk assessments are designed to keep you and others working with you safe and to avoid the accidents in any workplace that can cause serious harm. Risk assessing is a legal requirement if you're holding any type of event or activity which you become responsible for. The risk assessments are required by law. The Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 dictates that risk assessments are required to be done to prevent accidents occurring. There are other particular government guidelines such as noise at work regulations, manual handling, personal protective equipment, working at height, and there's many hundreds on that the government basically publish that are guidelines and law that say certain activities or things that are done have to be done in a certain way to make sure that people stay safe and don't get hurt. And basically, if you don't carry out a risk assessment and someone does get seriously hurt, basically the bottom line is that someone is going to end up going to court, and then you could end up in prison because you've neglected the fact that a serious accident could have been prevented. So, what is a risk assessment? A risk assessment is a systematic approach to hazard identification and control. It should be seen as the process that helps you identify what elements of an activity can cause injury to people and to introduce control measures that will reduce the risk of injury to an acceptable level. A risk assessment by law has to do the following. It has to identify who's responsible for the activity. So it's who is responsible for the health and safety, obvious. Identifies all of the risks that can potentially cause harm to anyone. It also identifies control measures which have or will be put into place to reduce any identified risks. It has to display the identified risks as a risk value, easy to understand to all who is involved, and then it has to be distributed to all who is involved, and it has to be reviewed periodically. So a risk assessment always has to identify all your risks. It has to show how the risks can be reduced using control measures, and then it has to show how you've distributed it as well, and it's also has to be shown how you review it. So you basically have to show that you've been looking, you review your risk assessments on a regular manner, depending on the activity. But if it's for like a show or event, you may be required to review it really quite a lot periodically up through the event and before in a short period of time up to the event, because your systems may change or new things may happen. So it's really important that you don't just write it and then it's kind of gone, okay, yeah, put that in the drawer, and then, oh, my event's in a month's time and maybe I'll just do my event. But actually what you need to do is go review it like a few days before and double check that everything that you have done is still relevant to what you're doing. So we are basically trying to stop the following examples ever happening. So we don't really want this sort of thing to happen. These guys are having a tea break in the shade. That's really bad. Why? I don't know. You can all see what what's going to happen. Yeah, just don't do this. This dude is going to go hospital pretty soon, along with this guy, because he's trying to use 2 ladders to trim his hedge. He just got the wrong equipment. This guy, yeah, the buckets at the bottom of the ladder, and poof, okay, yeah, and he's just stood on right at the top, yeah. Okay, so yeah, what is he thinking? There's going to be a huge amount of safer ways of painting the window frame that he's doing there. So yeah, it's just to avoid like people doing really stupid stuff and basically not hurting themselves or hurting you, and yeah, you get the idea. So let's take this example. Let's think about you're running up to an event. All of the things that you might need to think about when doing a risk assessment. So there's basically, when you're risk assessing, there are 5 steps. It's a 5-step process, because the government loves a 5-step process, as everyone has probably learned by now. This is actually something they basically came up with. Yeah, so this is basically like the way that it is designed, and the government basically wants you to do it. The first step is obviously to identify the hazards. Step 1. Step 2 is to identify who can be harmed. That can be quite easy. Step 3 will be to identify the current controls and to decide if any more are required. Step 4 will be to record your findings. Step 5 is to distribute and review as necessary. Pretty simple. Cool. So let's get into step 1, identifying the risks. The first thing you need to do is identify the hazards associated with the task or activity. One way of doing this is by using the abbreviation PEME, which is abbreviation of people, equipment, materials, environment. So it's basically an easy way of you being able to think about when you're looking at a room, a space, a field, anything that you might need to think about risk assessing, is to just think about these 5 things. So think about all the people that are involved, think about any equipment involved, think about the materials that might be used or involved. So materials could be absolutely anything and everything. It could be if you're working with wood, it would obviously be like the way that wood is cut or stored or things like that. Or environment could be anything to do with like the floor surface, could be the weather, could be the air temperature, could be that sort of thing. Cool. Let's think about people hazards. So people hazards cover a number of issues. Some of the hazards are to do with individuals themselves. Others are to do with the systems that people have to use. When thinking about people hazards, words such as training, capabilities, restrictions, supervision, communication, adequate numbers, and human error should come to mind. Those people need more training. So equipment, so relates to the equipment used, and we often cover tasks associated with the repair, maintenance, handling, cleaning, storage, operation of equipment. You can see that plug is dangerous. Material hazards. Material hazards will cover any solids, liquids, gases associated with the task. Not only covers substances that are required for the specific task, but also byproducts or wastes generated by the task or activity. So, yeah. So if you're like using paints, some paints are very dangerous. You could be using flammable liquids or gases. Environment hazards, all about the surroundings. So depending on the location and the activity, hazards could include poor lighting, heating, ventilation, poor access, tripping, restricted space, visibility, and anything else that could be taking place in the same area. Cool. Identifying hazards. So once you've gone through the first step, you should have a list of hazards associated with the task that could potentially result in injury for those at risk. So with your handout, I've got the picture, this picture. It's pretty big on there. But on your paper, if you could, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to look over the picture, and if you could just put a little circle or you don't have to, we won't be handing them in, we'll just be seeing if people can spot them. So see if you can spot all of the hazards in this image. I think there's 8. Okay, cool. So this is, would anybody like to, I'd quite like to find out what you think, where the hazards are. I've got a laser look. Would anybody like to point out any obvious, really obvious hazard? Yeah? Fire exit. This doorway. No, that's one that I had. It's not one I had. Yeah. He's holding the floor. Yeah, obvious hazards. Uneven floor surface. So this person here is going to obviously fall into the pit of doom. The boxes, yeah. So the boxes are obviously hazard. Anyone else? Anyone else?
What you call them, the pallets,
The pallet?
those ones?
These ones here, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah. So these pallets are obviously not stacked or put away properly, so they're obviously causing an obvious hazard where they could get tripped over. Lady carrying the box? Yeah. The one for her is why is she there? Why is she? She doesn't. Yeah, she doesn't look very happy about carrying the box. The box could be really heavy, so she should really be holding it underneath the box rather than if there's stuff in it that's really heavy, it could just drop out. Hmm?
No, I said, like, I don't know if that's heavy or not.
We don't know how heavy it is, no. We don't know how heavy, it could be really light. Yeah. Cool, right, so yeah, so these are the answers. Not knowing, so material hazard, so the stuff that's stored up high is doesn't have labels or names on the label, so it's, things can be a hazard if you don't know what's inside a container, so it's really important that when things are stored, they're correctly labeled so that if it's a hazardous material, you don't, if it's not labeled, you just open it up and, oh, and then it could be something really dangerous inside. So that's what that's about. I also thought that those kind of, whatever these things are here, they don't look like they're very well stored. They can look a bit wobbly. They might fall off the trolley, the shelving it. Poorly held blocks, stuff like that. Pallets broken, uneven floors, flammable waste building up, really important. Trip hazard here, and then more items not labeled. So that's pretty easy. So we know how to identify hazards now. So now we're going to work out who can be harmed. So you need to identify who can be harmed by each of the identified risks. So it could be yourself, could be other staff members, could be participants in the activity or event, referring to if we were doing an event or activity. Members of the public, adults or children who are just walking past at your area of activity. Or you also need to think about intruders that could break into your site area. And this could be adults or children. But I also like to think about also like these days we have a lot of people have animals, so could be pets. People, you know, like now that we're doing many more events outdoors, where we are doing events where people bring along their pet dogs and things, and they are actually identified hazards on my risk assessments because their animal could decide to bite someone, and that could cause someone harm. So, yeah. So step 3. What are the current controls? Step 3 has 2 parts. Firstly, you need to look at what control measures are currently in place for each hazard you have identified. In some cases, there may be no controls, perhaps because the hazard hasn't been considered. Or the other end of the scale, there may be good controls in place because the hazard is obvious and easily controlled. When trying to identify the current controls, remember that they can be broken in 3 ways. Physical controls, so something physical like a metal fence, a wall around an event site, that would be a physical. Procedural controls, so a safe working procedure for the task, so doing something in a safe procedural way. And behavioral controls, so making sure you have adequate supervision or monitoring of behavior, like enough management in place to make sure that other people are doing something correctly. Step 3, are additional controls required to reduce the risk? So you may need to ask yourself, can more be done? What other control measures are necessary? Before you can do this, we need to look at what is known as the hierarchy of control. Simply choosing a control measure is not enough. You need to be choosing the best, the most effective control, so far as you can for all tasks. You may have looked at a particular task, identified the current controls, and maybe thinking about adding extra controls. How do you know which controls are the best? So the hierarchy of control is really important because it is a way of controlling the hazard in the strongest, most practical way. Quite often you might find, actually, like people using signage and like personal protective equipment might be like the top of their list of like, oh, that's how we're going to make sure that people don't get hurt. But actually, they are at the bottom. Obviously, the number 1 is to completely eliminate the hazard. So, is there a way of not having the hazard at all involved? Oh, sorry. So yeah, it could be just Can you do it a different way? Can you not get involved in doing your activity with that particular hazard? Can you substitute the hazard for something else that is safer? That was number 2. Number 3, contain the hazard at the source. So can it be whatever's causing the hazard, can it be completely like boxed in? Can it be locked away? Can it be like not accessed by people? Can it, Number 4, obviously, remove the employee from the hazard. So how can you think of a way to stop physically people going near the hazard? 5 is reducing exposure. So is there a way of thinking that, can you be involved in that hazard in a lesser way? Then we go into the things that people often put at the top of the list, which is things like put up a warning sign, be careful, this thing is dangerous. And then 7 is obviously personal protective equipment. So that's allowing you to do it, but then you have some protective equipment to carry on. And then 8 is discipline. So like management saying you can only do this in a certain way. Cool. And then once you've obviously got your risks identified, we then need to record your findings. So the example risk assessment, which is in your handout, shows how risks are rated using a matrix system. So that's the matrix system is the colorful table, which is used to basically generate a number, which is the risk rating. And it's a clever little system where you basically get a number which you put on your risk assessment to show how high, low, medium, high, or intolerable the identified risk is, and then how you can put in control measures to reduce the risk to a manageable level so that you can then continue with the activity. So it's a system where you rate how bad the original hazard is, and then once you've added your control measures in, you give it a reduced rating, which, as long as it fits into either medium or low, then you may carry on. So low is obviously you've identified the hazard as a slight, very slight risk, but because it's simple, it can be kind of resolved with like something simple, a simple control measure such as PPE or signage. So I'm thinking something like where the cleaner goes and cleans the shop every day, and then to make sure, because obviously when she's mopping the floor, it could be a slip hazard for potential employers to come in. She uses a sign to make sure that people know that she's recently cleaned the floor. That would come in as kind of a low one. Medium, obviously, it's a risk that has control measures, but you can still carry on. So you put in some. So it's something that's like, I don't know, like using a gas bottle, like propane gas or something for your event or activity. But because you've followed the government guidance about how to safely use propane gas bottles by putting them in a metal cage, and it's away from the public, and it's locked away, and you've got only one person is allowed to access it, and it's got a safety valve on it, and everything's done in a way that is appropriate and is to the legislation, and then it can carry on. But if that gas bottle was used without the control measures, so it was just left in the middle of the room, it was also right next to the flaming fire torch that you've connected up to it, and you haven't put it out of the way, and it can easily be heated up by the fire, and obviously that would be an incredibly dangerous thing, and that wouldn't pass the risk assessment. Then high risks are basically, you've said it's extremely dangerous and people will definitely get hurt, and then you can think of all the control measures you can think of, and if your risk rating is still coming out as a high, then basically you can't carry on until you can really think of more control measures to reduce it down to medium. And then intolerable is like something that is just absolutely stupid. You just don't do it, whatever. Yeah. So if you end up with a score rating of 25, like you just need to think about like, okay, what is going on here? We need to just like remove everything and everyone from this and not carry on at all. No matter what I do, I cannot make it lower. Okay, so that's the table. I've just gone through it. It's quite simple. You basically times your likelihood by severity, and then you end up with your risk rating, whether it's low, medium, or high, or intolerable. So, cool, right. So, on the handout, I have given you a really basic one line out of one of our risk assessments. And it just so happens to be about COVID, because we love COVID. Yeah. So this is just a table out of one of our COVID risk assessments for the theatre. This basically is just an example to show you like just a really smart way and simple way of creating a risk assessment. It's based on the ones which the government actually put on their website as a guide to, this is how you should record your risk assessment. So next slide. Oh, yeah, it's in big on the screen as well. You should basically have one of these tables for every single risk that you identify. So if it's some, let me just think. So let's pretend I'm a theatre teacher and I'm coming into this theatre and I'm going to teach theatre to some young people. You might not have, and you're not doing anything that's kind of really crazy with fire or anything like that. You might find that you don't have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of risks, because like the venue would have already done a risk assessment to make sure that when you come in and use the space, it's all safe. But as a theatre teacher, you need to think about certain things that you're doing to make sure that they stay safe. So you might not have loads and loads of these, but when we're doing like a big event, like an outdoor show where we're responsible for the audience, we're responsible for how the site's managed, we're responsible for the health and safety, for the electrics, for the water or the weather, like literally everything that could harm anyone that gets involved. You could have hundreds and hundreds of risks, which can take a long time to do. But it's really important, because at the end of the day, if you're found to be neglecting the fact that you've not helped stop people getting hurt because of something that's obvious that should be controlled, then you can go to prison and all that stuff, and that's really not nice. And also the company you work for will also end up being, they can get massive, massive fines, like I'm talking hundreds of thousands of pounds. And so if it was something that really badly happened to this organization, it would literally, it'd wipe it out for pretty much ever, because they'd never be able to recover from having to pay out huge fines because of neglect of someone getting seriously injured or being killed because of neglect. So this is what I use to create my risk assessments, basically. I create a table for every risk or hazard. So for this COVID-19 one, we are talking about the space and the environment. So people coming in and coming into the theatre and what might happen because of COVID. So the hazards are that people might touch contaminated surfaces which already have COVID-19 on them, and or they might contract COVID-19 from human interactions. So that's the activity. The risk is obviously they'll get COVID. So who could be effective? So all staff and all visitors. And then the severity. So we have level 3 severity. The likelihood is 5. Risk rating of 15. Is it as low as, so basically your initial assessment is based on the fact that if you did no controls whatsoever, so like how bad could it really be, what is the absolute worst case, and then this part of the table is obviously where you explain everything that you're doing to mitigate and stop people from either touching stuff or contracting COVID. So I've talked about staff maintaining 2 meters distancing, wearing masks, social distancing, ensure adequate ventilation. All doors and windows can be open for air ventilation, ongoing supervision and monitoring, operating staff to ensure that social distancing, adhere to room capacities, practitioners have their own box equipment, use of disinfectant wipes, hand sanitizer, blah, blah. So once we've done that, we're now gone, okay, severity is now much lower, the likelihood still quite high, risk rating is 5, and is that as low as possible? Yes, it is, that we can do. Cool. So once you have basically created your risk assessment, which is basically all of highlighting all of your risks in the table format like this, they're never really officially completed. They're always seen as an ongoing document. You never even though you finish it and you kind of get it signed off to say, okay, I've done as much as I possibly can do, by kind of law and stuff. They're never really completed. They're always supposed to be ongoing and they're always supposed to be reviewed. So you have to basically be checking on it and making sure that you're current all the way up to the event and during the event or activity or whatever's going on. You need to make risk assessments easily available to anyone who's involved. So that is also really, really important. So anyone who is getting involved in your building or activity or anything you're organising or you're responsible for, you have to make sure that everyone who can easily access it if they want to, and the key people who you're working with who are involved in your processes can have read it and agreed to it and understand it. And you basically, don't just file it away to gather dust. And you need to keep the document for at least 5 years after any event or activity. That's because something may occur at your activity, which then has a repercussion that could cause someone an injury, but they might try and kind of pursue damages for their through the courts or whatever for quite a few number of years after. So it's by law that you're supposed to keep them for at least 5 years. Cool. In summary, risk assessment process is a process that can be applied to all activities in the workplace. The key elements are identifying the hazards, do what is suitable and sufficient. Remember, PEME, people, equipment, materials, environment, identifying who can be harmed, identifying what you are doing and at the moment to control the risk and be asking, can I do more? Recording, distributing and reviewing your assessments at regular intervals. And there's the government guidelines on hse.gov.uk for extra help and support. And it's obviously now completely exploded with all the COVID stuff. And that's it for my basic kind of show of explaining how to do a risk assessment. But I'm open now to questions or anything that you would like to know more about in detail.
What was the fifth point in the 5-step? Second or third slide. So identify the risk, who can be harmed, the current control, recording your findings. I missed the fifth point.
Environment?
No, I got that one, yeah. That one, yes.
Distributing. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. So risk assessment is always about like what's practical. It's something that's is required, but it's about having a kind of like a practical head on yourself and thinking, what is the most practical thing to do? You could be quite over the top with health and safety, and it really does bug me sometimes when you see some of the things that are just way over the top. Yeah, it's pretty mad when when you see some things where people have literally just gone, actually, yes, you maybe have needed one or two controls, but they've just done way too much. And actually you might be, and I hate to see it when things are massively, what's the word, like hampered or kind of like reduced because of so much health and safety, if you know what I mean. So that's one of my bugbears of health and safety, but it's really important. Anyone got any other questions?
Something that is already been taken care of. Should it be a hazard? I mean, if it is already been taken.
It's good to always highlight something that you spot, but your control measure could be that something like the management is already controlling the hazard that you've identified. It's always good to have kind of paper trail for everything that you say. You might think that the hazard has been fully controlled by someone else, but just by you identifying and then kind of creating a paper trail which then says that someone else is dealing with the thing that you've identified. And as long as they are aware of you knowing about it and explaining that their control measures are important, then that's what should be done. And if you're not happy with what their control measures are, then you either have to decide whether or not you yourself have to control it your own way, because whatever way is not being done appropriately, or whether you need to talk to the management, whoever is dealing with that control, to do it better. Yeah.
Are you required to have it on paper, or can you have it like on the computer?
You can just have it on a computer, which is good. So yeah, you don't have to print them out. Sometimes it's useful. I like to have them printed up if you're in a situation where you might be asked upon to show it in a place where you can't bring it up on a computer or something. So if you're out in the field in the middle of nowhere and you're there for a number of days and you're not near internet access and you can't just quickly email it, or you know that you might be asked upon by someone who might just turn up and say, hang on, I want to see your documentation on using this thing. You can, what's quite good is if you've got it printed off, then you can say, hey, look, straight away, here's all the stuff, and if you're not happy with it, then yeah, then we'll take it further. Cool. Any questions? Yeah.
Obviously, there are like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of risks. Would you ever have like a cut-off where you just keep going?
If you've got that many risks, you probably need to be thinking, whatever I'm trying to do, should I be really doing it? Say for like, let's say we're just doing a dance class in here or something. I think the risk assessment for in here, like doing one here, is probably about 20-ish risks. And then if I was doing like a middle scale, large scale outdoor event activity where you're involving the public and the weather and multiple different ways in which people could be hurt through, like running portable power supplies or using special equipment. I could be looking at doing a risk assessment that probably has about up to probably about 40, 50 risks, is a really big one. But then when you're starting to deal with a really high number of risks, and you might be dealing with some activities or which have like a certain way of using them, there's this thing called a method statement, which can be accompanied with a risk assessment. And it's basically another form where you show your exact method of using a certain or doing a certain thing in a certain way. It's a thing that is normally used in like the building industry. So it's like they would often have method statements for literally all of like construction and building sites and things like that. It is relevant to the events industry because, like for example, erecting a stage. If you're using like a lot of trussing and staging equipment, or it's important that you may detail an exact method that you're doing it, because that can have an implementations on the actual risks that are involved. So if you're showing that you basically the instructions on how it's done and showing, and that can be distributed to all the people doing it, then they all know exactly how the thing should be done in the most safe way. But if you've not shown the method, the correct method, and distributed the correct method to the employees, and they could be more likely to have an accident. So, a method statement is often accompanied with risk assessments. Any questions?
Yeah. Say that you are the person in charge from the company to do the risk assessment, and then the venue asks you for it. But then, should you ask the venue as well to do their risk assessment? And if you're the person in charge, who else is in need to see the risk assessment? Only you to cover your backs, or do you have a requirement to show it to the team? Or
yeah, it can vary. So, so here as a venue, we have a big bunch of risk assessments which cover all kind of basic activity, like everything that we might do in specific circumstances. So, for example, like when I need to set the lights up in here, we have a risk assessment which just covers us using equipment to access the rig to put the lights in and adjust them and focus them and stuff. But whereas if I had like a visiting company come in, like a touring theatre company, I don't know exactly what they might be doing as part of their, when they do their get in and install, what exactly they're doing during their show, exactly what they're doing part of their get out, whether or not they're like interacting with the audience, whether or not, risk assessment's a really good way of, like with venues and visiting companies, of explaining like all of the stuff that's a little bit dangerous. So that in advance we can be prepared and go, okay, yeah, I can understand what you're doing. Whereas if you didn't send the risk assessment to me, I might be a bit surprised and worried when I start seeing the theatre company doing stuff like climbing up ladders and things like that. It's important also to know, okay, yes, you are doing something a little bit risky, so such as like using a live candle on stage or something. Like what that is generally a thing that is quite not allowed in many theatres because of the dangers of fire, but actually it can be done as long as you have many adequate control measures in place, such as actually we have a stage manager who's literally side of stage ready, who has eyes on it the whole time. Like that's a really important thing. There's a way of extinguishing that flame in the event that when it needs to go out, it's done in a real safe way. It's not just like the candle doesn't just randomly fall over. That's a really important thing. And the way it's lit is a really important thing because we 100% avoid matches, because when you're lighting a match, you could light the match and then the match could go flying off and start a fire in the corner. So we always use like safety lighters as a control measure of lighting a fire. So using a safer way of doing it rather than using a match. And then I would say, depending on what the actual risks are, so if you were telling me that you were going to come into our theatre and you were going to have lots of candles on site, I would maybe want to talk to our fire warden, who might want to overlook the fire risk assessment to just make sure that everything you've got in place is safe. If you were wanting to rig things off the ceiling, we'd need to maybe show it to check that the weight's not going to overload the loading of the lighting bars, or it really does depend on what the risks are, but we may, or it might be something that is highlighted, and I might want to show it to upper management. Just knowing what the risks are, really. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, it basically depends on what it is and whether how bad it is and who we decide to tell about it.
How do you order a risk assessment? Like, would you put like the biggest risk at the top, or do you just do it in order?
Good question. You don't have to in a particular order, but I like to do it in a kind of practical order of like process. So, so if you were, whatever the activity is, so first of all, it's like walking into the room. What could be, if one of the potential hazards is that there's cables trailing on the floor, perhaps trip hazard and slip hazard could be the first thing. Like when I'm risk assessing, I basically just go around with a notebook and I just like think, okay, right, I'm an absolute idiot, and what are all the things that could either trip, could hurt me in any particular way, and you just write them all down, like just in a great big long list, and nail them all like that. With the COVID stuff that's happening now, it's quite important to kind of group all the COVID stuff together. It's quite nice to group all of like similar hazards together. You know what I mean? Try and make it as easy for the layman person that's reading it to kind of understand it in a really succinct way, I guess. Cool. Any other questions about risk assessment?
Jamie,
yes.
What's the most precarious thing you've ever had to risk assess?
Precarious.
Or maybe a better question is, what's the most common thing where you see on a risk assessment and you go, or go into a space, or see it in the show and you go, no, you can't do that?
Yeah. So it's things like using pyrotechnics, but then not really done with safe control measures. I've often seen things like hanging or trying to hang something up really heavy and just going, oh yeah, we'll make sure it's quite often people will say they'll acknowledge that something is dangerous, but then they won't really think about how they're actually going to make sure that it's safe and controlled. That's the most common thing that I see. And quite often people just forget about simple things as well. Like making sure that, people are fed and watered happily, and how you're going to make sure that if you're in control of a crew of people, how you're going to make sure they can have a drink and they can use the loo and things like that. And actually, that's quite important thing. Precarious things. Often, if it's something that's really precarious, you have to put in something quite major to mitigate it. So we've had I've done people hanging off the rig in Drake Circus. So we did a show in Drake Circus a few years ago, hanging out of the sky. We had, in the same show, we had people hiding in wooden boxes, which were being pushed around. So we had to make sure they've got enough air to breathe. The claustrophobia won't set in for too long. Trying to think of anything really major. Done a lot of stuff like fire. Fire is really dangerous in many ways. Controlling fires is a tough one. You just have to have you have to really think about. So in so many ways, the hierarchy of control is quite important. Apart from obviously not having the fire because you want to have the fire because it looks cool. It's like, okay, right, to have that fire, we've got to have a safety valve, we've got to have the gas has to be in a safe area, only certain people have to use it, blah, blah. Just everything we do, like using vehicles and loading and unloading, really important. Basic things are often forgotten where people don't have proper safety, but always wear these shoes, safety take-out boots. Things like how the weather can affect things. Often events and things, assumptions are made based on the fact that it's going to be a lovely sunny day, and that what actually will happen if it's a bit windy or if it is a bit rainy, or
Cancel the show.
Try and tell an audience that.
So like the Barbican Theatre recently did the back alley puppet parade, and the weather was actually a big hinge on the risk assessment, actually allowing us to go ahead with the event that we wanted to do. Because the puppets that we were building and had are made of just very lightweight material. They basically were giant sails and flags. And people holding them up would really struggle if there was actually any like medium wind speeds. We had to have the perfect weather conditions really for it to go ahead. And luckily we did that. So there's certain elements that you might find as part of your risk assessment that you have to have an event stop, or the event is cancelled, or the event has to be postponed, or because of something that is in your risk assessment. And that's really important that people understand that, because you often find that things can get pushed forward. Oh no, we can still do it, we can still do it. But at the end of the day, if the person who's responsible for the risk assessment, they have the kind of final say about whether they've decided that the risk is too dangerous to go ahead, then perhaps the activity has to stop, which is the first part of hurricane control, where you basically remove everything from the activity. Cool. Any other questions? And I'm quite open and to anyone just asking me questions privately, or if you want some advice. I've given lots of advice to people having to write risk assessments before. And I'm quite open and willing to share risk assessments that I've done. So I've helped out a number of organisations the last many years, gone back with having things like having the template, having like a starting point, because we've done so many that I can go, oh yeah, I can get the risk assessment where we did the show on the Tall Point Ferry. And you're doing the show on the Tall Point Ferry. Why don't you have a look at my risk assessment? Because I've perhaps done a lot of the thinking for you, or a good starting point. The time when we did an event where we hired vintage buses and we drove people from here to Rawling Yard. There's a big risk assessment about that. Yeah, there's many things that I've done that I might be able to support any of you guys. My email address is on the website. Quite happy to get in touch, or want to come in and have a chat. I'm quite happy for that in a COVID safe way. Yeah, thank you.